Hi, I'm Clare Linton. I'm from the Urban Transport Group, and I'm going to talk a bit about taking a strategic approach to taxis and private hire vehicles. Just a little bit of context, the Urban Transport Group is a membership organisation. We represent transport authorities at city region scales, people like Transport for London, Transport for Greater Manchester. And they're obviously grappling with some of the changes around some of the smart mobility stuff we've heard about, but also around taxis and private hire in the cities. The taxi market in the UK is made up of two different types of business model. You have the Hackney carriages, which are traditional black cabs in some cities, but they're the ones you see on a taxi rank outside the station, and you can hail them on the street. And then you have private hire vehicles, which you have to pre-book, usually on the phone, but you can't sort of hail them on the street. And then this has been disrupted by new innovations like Uber and others who are app-based. And then they're sort of challenging that business model, because if you can book a Uber instantly on the street, are you almost digitally hailing that vehicle? So they're licensed as private hire vehicles, but are challenging both the private hire and the taxi market. And they're also licensed under a really loose framework. So it's really old legislation. It was written for horse and carriages in the 1800s, and we're still using that as the legal framework today. And obviously that's couldn't even begin to anticipate the kind of changes we're seeing in the sector now. These transformations are having a huge impact on our cities. We've seen huge growth in private hire vehicles. There's now one private hire vehicle in London for every 100 people. Private hires have increased 70% in the UK since 2005, and in the West Midlands, private hires have increased by 45% between 2015 and 2017. So this is huge growth and a huge number of vehicles are now on our streets, having impacts on congestion, air quality, all of the kind of public policy goals that our cities are trying to deal with. And sometimes without much in the way of licensing powers. So in London, the taxis and private hire are licensed by TfL at the whole city region level, but elsewhere they're licensed by local councils. So we have a situation where councils are licensing the vehicles, often with completely different sets of licensing regulations and fees. And then you've got a strategic transport body that's setting the tone for the wider city. So they might be setting the air quality agenda or trying to mitigate congestion or provide public transport. We should note that in Manchester, they're actually consulting on moving to common standards across the city region, and that will help to bring everything in line and deal with some of the challenges that having this different framework for different cities results in. And I should also say that although you might license your vehicles in, say, Wigan, and Wigan's really interesting because they do a discount for low-emission vehicles, those vehicles can operate anywhere. So you might be incentivising low-emission vehicles in Wigan, but you might have vehicles from Bolton or Bury or wherever else operating in your borough. So the impacts that you think you'll deliver on air quality through incentivising low-emission vehicles, you might not see on the ground because you've got vehicles coming in from elsewhere. So that's creating a big challenge. And like I say, the legislation's really, really old. It was created before the creation of these new app-based innovations. The DfT produces best practice guidance, but that's now more than 8 years old. So again, before we saw the transformation we're seeing with Uber. So we think we need changes to take into account the changes we're seeing in the sector. So why should we take a strategic approach to taxis and private hire? So congestion. Cities are trying to deal with congestion. It has a big impact on economic growth. It's a drag on economic growth. It has air quality impacts. And where we've got these large numbers of private hire vehicles flooding the streets, they're contributing to congestion. It also has an impact on our bus networks. If we've got congested streets, you're slowing down buses, and that starts to erode the value of having that bus network there. Integration with public transport. So our colleague from Uber earlier said that they are often serving the first and last mile of journeys, and that is true. Often, you might get a train somewhere and get a taxi for the next part of your journey. So we need to think about how we integrate taxi and private hire with the public transport system, and also to try and help make sure we're not competing with public transport and undermining that public transport network and all the social and benefits that public transport can bring. Air quality and carbon emissions. So increasing numbers of vehicles are contributing to air quality and carbon challenges. In London, we've got an ultra-low emission zone coming, and there's really good incentives there for moving taxis over to more low-emission versions. So there's a new range-extended hybrid black cab, which is pretty shiny and cool. So we need to start seeing how we can incentivise taxi and private hire drivers to move to more low-emission models. Nottingham are doing some really ambitious stuff around helping to support their taxi drivers with moving to the low-emission version, especially because they are more expensive. So we need to look at how we can support drivers to move to those vehicles. Public safety. So this is a complicated one because they kind of have pros and cons for public safety. So has been, in recent years, some high-profile cases of taxis being involved in exploitation of vulnerable groups, and we need to look at how we make sure that people are safe in taxis and they're not being used for sort of criminal activity. But on the opposite side of that, as I mentioned, sort of taxis are often last mile of the journey, and they're often used at times when there isn't all of the public transport options available. So they have a public safety benefit in that they get people home when maybe there aren't other options available. So we need to recognise the value of taxis in public safety and make sure that we go further and do more on ensuring that people are safe when they're using those vehicles. Social inclusion. So taxis play a really important role for people with additional mobility needs. We see the black cabs are all sort of wheelchair accessible. We need to look at how we balance the black cabs and private hire to make sure that we're not losing those accessibility benefits that taxis can bring, and ensuring that we're making sure that we keep that wheelchair accessible part of the market and support that and make sure that they can provide that transport for those with additional needs. And then finally, sort of urban realm and identity. The black cab is sort of an iconic symbol of London, and I think that people are really keen to retain that and protect that and not lose that part of our heritage. So we need to think about how we balance the two parts of the market and ensure that we sort of keep that part of our identity. And by contrast, we also need to make sure that if we're having huge numbers of vehicles on our streets and we've got congested streets, that we protect our urban realm and have a positive urban realm and aren't filling it with vehicles that maybe waiting for hails. I know my experience, I live not very far away, which is very convenient for Leeds Station, and we get a lot of private hire vehicles waiting in our road for a hail at the station, so it has an impact on my immediate urban realm. So that was just some of the public policy agenda items where taxi and private hire are having an impact. But we think there's a case for a more strategic approach to taxi and private hire, particularly sort of at the city, region, strategic level, trying to bring it together and ensuring that the taxi and private hire market contributes to the kind of cities we want and helps us to deliver on these public policy agendas and not make things worse.
You mentioned just then about kind of using taxis for that last mile situation. Is there any methods, any ways that you're thinking of increasing that and making it more integrating that last mile situation? Thinking
about how we present information to travellers is really interesting, and it might be that if you know that there's going to be a taxi at a station, when you get there, you choose to take the train rather than driving the whole way. So I think thinking about how we present consumer information is really important. And also, I showed on that slide there, but how we signpost people. So when you get to the station, you know where the taxis are, and you're not stood there going, I don't know where to go. And I think having those positive traveller experiences can help to shift behaviours.
If we're sort of saying with sort of Uber that Uber Pool is displacing Uber X, then is Uber Pool also displacing public transportation? And if it is, do we have it modelled? And sort of does that then go against public policy of driving down emissions because we've got more taxis now instead of having a single bus?
Still early days to pick out these trends, but I think that it probably is having an impact on public transport. We are seeing declining bus patronage in the UK and in London, and some of that, the trends, it's hard to pick out exactly what all of that is, but it's probably part down to private hire. It's also part cycling, and we're seeing increase in cycling, which is great, but that is taking people away from public transport. And it, it's cheap, it's affordable. Like if there's two of you, then getting in an Uber is probably cheaper than the bus. So it's not surprising that it's appealing. How we manage that is really tricky, isn't it? I think the jury's out, but I think it probably is having an impact, and how we deal with that is going to be challenging.
How open do you think the taxi and private hire industry is to ride sharing, which isn't done via app? So, for example, at the station, who's going to X location?
I think at the moment, probably not very open. I think there's quite a lot of resistance in the industry, and you know, to some degree it's understandable. They've had this industry for a long time, and this has come somewhat out of nowhere and disrupted that. But I mean, they will have to adapt. And you see, I mean, I don't know where from, but in Leeds, a lot of the non-Uber private hire companies have apps now, and that, you know, makes it, you know, it's harder to see why to compete at that market. I think they will other companies will have to start to adapt and change as well.
Me again. So you mentioned about personal security, and one of the main reasons that sometimes I'll select an Uber is that I can share my location, I know who my driver is, I can send a note to my boyfriend saying where I am and when I'm coming home. And that is the kind of thing against black cabs, because obviously sometimes there has been some kind of scandals in the news about it. Is there anything you think you can do about that to kind of make all forms of taxis feel a bit safer?
There's been some stuff around having CCTV in private hire and taxis, and some companies do that now. Some places in the world, I don't know if there's anywhere in the UK, but in some places in the world, it's mandatory now. You have to have CCTV in your vehicle. I think at the moment, I should have said, but the only criteria to be a taxi and private hire driver is to be a fit and proper person. Which usually, you know, most licensing authorities are using a criminal record check, probably an enhanced driving test. But we should actually have a legal minimum standard of what drivers should have to meet. It shouldn't just be a loose term of fit and proper person. So I think in terms of public safety, there's a lot you could do in legislation, and I think we do need more of that.